Wanted to talk a little bit about some upcoming changes to the city's water right permits. But let me start off by saying that the city gets its water from two sources, from Cheney Reservoir situated west of town and from a well field located in the Equus Beds aquifer north of town. Normally, during normal non-drought years, we have more than enough water to meet our demands. We actually spill water at the Cheney Reservoir most years. However, as part of responsible water planning, we have to prepare for droughts. This is a part of the country where we do sometimes have droughts. And so what we've done is council has made a decision to prepare for a 1% design drought. What that means is that this is a drought that happens, you would expect it about once every 100 years. An example of that kind of a drought would be the Dust Bowl drought of the 30s. And so that's the kind of plan that we have in place to make sure that if we should find ourselves in that severe a drought, we have the necessary water resources and, as importantly, the kinds of operational procedures to be able to get through that kind of a drought. The operation is the part that is, we have the water that we have. The operation's the part that we have to make sure that we make adjustments to be able to get through that drought. And that's controlled to a large extent by the city's permits, water rights that we have and how we can use them. So what we've done is we've suggested a couple of changes to those the water rights to make it more effective for us to get through a drought, and more importantly, to protect the amount and quality of water that's in that precious resource, the Equus Beds aquifer. So I'm going to start with a bathtub diagram. This is a representation of the water that's in the aquifer near our well field, the wells that we have. And in reality, each well has its own depth. And if you wanted it to be very accurate, we'd have a bathtub diagram like this for each well. But for purposes of explanation, we've looked at the average water levels and came up with this bathtub diagram. So the situation right now is we have a treatment plant up north, and we take water out of the Little Arkansas River when it's there and available, and we treat it to very high standards, and then we put that water down into the aquifer. And actually, we're taking water, treating it, and putting it into the aquifer with the idea that we accumulate credits, meaning that someday if we get into a drought, we can use those credits, and that's above the amount of water that we have with our normal water rights. So we have 40,000 acre feet of water that we can pull out in a year, but that's not going to be enough for us at the last part of a drought. We're going to need to add to that because we're planning that the Cheney Reservoir will go dry or be so low that we can't really use it. That means we're going to have to put a greater demand on our well field, and our normal water right that's in that well field is just not adequate for us to get through the drought. So we have to add to that water right, and the way that we do that is by treating this water and putting it in the ground like a bank account so that we can draw it out sometime in the future. That's a very critical part of our drought response plan. So this bathtub diagram really gives an explanation of what it is that we're looking at as far as our operations. This is what you're seeing here is the way that we would operate today. We would start off with the aquifer being somewhere about 91% full, and that you can see that's 26 feet down below the surface, and that's where we would be at the start of a drought. We could then draw water out of the aquifer during the drought until we hit a level called the 1993 level. That's the level that the aquifer was at in the year 1993, and the ability or the right for us to be able to draw our ASR credits, recharge credits, are limited to the water level being above that 93 level. Once we get to that 93 level, we can no longer draw aquifer or recharge credits. We have to leave them basically in the aquifer. So right now, in order for us to be able to maximize the use of those credits, we would draw very early and very hard on those credits so that we made sure that we got as many of them as we could before the level of the aquifer went down to that 93 level. That's about 2 years of pulling on that aquifer on those credits. About every 2 years, or it would take us 2 years to get down to that 93 level. In other words, we want to use all of our credits in those 2 years. This is a strategy that we presently use because we're operating within the current requirements of our water permit. What this graphic also shows you is even after a 1% drought, in other words, we're at the very end of the 1930s style drought, you can see that we're still 85% of the aquifer still full. We have not drawn down the aquifer, even in a severe drought, down to making it nearly empty. There's still 85% of the aquifer left, even after that kind of a drought, 44 feet deep. You figure that the aquifer on average is about 200 feet deep. So if a drought should occur, the first year of the drought, we need to start pulling on those recharge credits. We get them all within 2 years. That would be before we got down to the 93 level, and we would, because of having to take all of those credits within 2 years, we are looking at the frequency of that kind of a drought conditions for 2 years long. We expect to see that about every 10 years. So every 10 years, we would be doing an accelerated removal of the recharge credits out of the aquifer, and we would be getting down to that 93 level, and at the end of the 1% drought, we'd be at about 44 feet or 85%. Well, that works. If we find ourselves in a drought, this is the kind of approach that we would use to be able to get through that drought. But there's a better way. And that's why we've asked the state to consider changing our permits that allows us to withdraw our recharge credits in a different way. In other words, instead of making the 93 level the limit to where we can pull our recharge credits out of the aquifer, we're asking the state to lower that limit so that we can draw at lower levels in the aquifer, we can draw those recharge credits. What that means is we can draw them out later and slower. We can get, if we drop it down to the proposed lower limit, what we can do is we can take 3 years, and if we wait a year, we could even make that out to 4 years. So instead of 2 years, now we're talking 3 or 4 years before we get to that old 93 level. And not only that, what happens is that you have a higher level for at the end of the drought. Now you're talking about 86% instead of the 85% that we were before, and that's good because now we're leaving a little bit more water in the aquifer, not only for ourselves but the others that make use of that water. By giving ourselves more flexibility on how often and how much we have to take those credits so that we can still get through our design drought, we leave more water in the reservoir, and at the end of the drought, the water's higher in the reservoir. So we think this is good for the reason that more water in the aquifer is good. It means more water for everybody in those drought conditions. And the other thing too is there's salt that is slowly moving into this well field, and the best way to slow down the intrusion of that salt plume into the well field is by keeping the levels of water in the aquifer as high as possible. That slows down how fast that salt wants to move into the aquifer. So if you are talking about it taking 3 or 4 years now to take those credits, that means that you're looking at a drought event that's 3 or 4 years long, and now instead of it being 10 years long, you'd be doing this every 10 years, you'd be doing this about every 14 years. So when we say 10 years and 14 years, in the meantime, we're not in a drought. We've got so much water in both our aquifer and in our reservoir that we would not be drawing on these credits. We'd leave them in the aquifer to keep the aquifer full and healthy. And as a matter of fact, we'd have more than enough water through non-drought years. So that brings us to the second modification we're talking about making in the aquifer, and that is when we run the ASR, Aquifer Storage and Recovery Treatment Plant. We take the water out of the Little Arkansas River and treat it at that plant. We could either put it into the ground, or we could send it back to the city and use it as water that could be further treated at our main water treatment plant. The problem with having the aquifer at a very full level is that there's no place to put the water that we treat. If the groundwater levels are very high, there is no room for us to be able to put those recharge water credits into the ground, and so there's no incentive for us to run the treatment plant and to be able to accumulate those credits. So the way that we do it, so that we can still meet our drought operational plan, is we actually draw down the aquifer down to that 91% level, meaning that we have to draw it down and keep it lower so that every year that we have the opportunity to recharge, there's room in the aquifer to put those recharge credits. Well, what if we could to get recharge credits for those for that water that we treat and that we send to town? If we don't have to put it into the ground, we send it to town. Well, what that means is that now we can have a much higher aquifer level. Instead of it being 91% full, we can let it get as full as it can be practically, which is 98%, which is what the level is right now that we've been testing to see how full can we get that aquifer. What that means is now the aquifer on average is much higher, at a higher level, fuller, and that's good for all the people who use that water. It reduces the drift of the salt plume even more into that aquifer, and it doesn't cause a increase and reduction, radical changes in level, which is good for the water quality. So what we would like to do is we'd like to get what we call maintenance credits, so that when we treat that water out of the river, we can send it to town and get credits for it, just as though we were sticking it into the ground, recharging it into the ground. And by this regulation change, then we don't have to keep that aquifer level down low enough to have room to put that water in. We could leave the aquifer very, very full, which is in everybody's best interest. So right now, we can operate under the existing permit. We have a way to be able to meet our requirements for the drought protection. But these are two changes that we would like to see made to our permit, so that we can still meet our requirements for drought protection, but we can do it in a way that's healthier for the aquifer. We can do it now without these changes, but if we had these changes, we could do it in a way that was even better and more beneficial for the aquifer. So that's basically the explanation of the two changes that we're seeking to make to our water permit for the purposes of continuing to meet our drought resiliency, but do it in such a way that is even better for the health and sustainability of the aquifer.